Have you ever wondered why God allows suffering to enter your life when all you seek is His peace? It's a question that weighs heavily on the heart of many believers, especially when we face moments of isolation or hardship. C.S. Lewis once said, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." This profound thought speaks to the very nature of our struggles. We believe in His goodness, but we wrestle with the pain that often accompanies His perfect plan. Lewis uses the metaphor of an artist sculpting a masterpiece to illustrate God's work in our lives. Just as a sculptor chisels away at rough edges, God reshapes us, even when the process feels harsh or lonely. Every painful moment serves a greater purpose, a refining of our soul to reflect His glory more fully. Are you willing to trust Him through the discomfort, knowing that He sees the beauty that will emerge from the trial? Stay with us as we continue to explore how God's plans, even in the midst of suffering, are designed to bring us closer to our true, transformed selves. Let's journey together in faith. It can be incredibly painful when those we love leave us, especially those we believed would stand by us no matter what. The sense of abandonment cuts deep, leaving a void that feels impossible to fill. This emptiness, however, is not a punishment but a divine invitation. In these moments of profound loss, God's voice becomes most audible, calling us back to Himself. C.S. Lewis, in his poignant reflections, often highlighted how God uses our pain as His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. As Lewis insightfully wrote, "Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." When everything around us crumbles, it is often God's way of stripping away the distractions, revealing that our true satisfaction and peace can only be found in Him. It's easy to wonder why such heartache is allowed. Why does God permit those closest to us to walk away? But as Lewis reminds us, it's often in our loneliness and pain that we realize just how distant we have grown from God. Perhaps those people who left were there only to draw us further from Him, keeping us distracted from the relationship that matters most. When everything else is taken away, we are left face to face with the one who truly completes us. This void we feel is no ordinary emptiness, it is a space only God can fill. Any attempt to fill it with worldly pleasures, achievements, or relationships will ultimately fail. C.S. Lewis famously said, "God cannot give us a happiness and peace apart from Himself, because it is not there." There is no such thing. His words echo the profound truth of Matthew 6, verse 33, "Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." The message is clear: the things we chase after, be they relationships, success, or material possessions, cannot bring us lasting fulfillment. Only when we seek God, placing Him at the center of our lives, can we experience the peace and joy that our hearts long for. This emptiness you feel is not a curse, but a gift, pointing you back to the source of true contentment, God. In the stillness of our souls, when the noise of the world has faded, we may ask ourselves where true solace lies. The answer, as Lewis and Scripture both affirm, is in the intimate relationship with God. Revelation 3, verse 20 provides a beautiful picture of this divine connection. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me." God is always near, waiting for us to turn to Him, to open the door of our hearts, and to invite Him into the very spaces that feel empty. When you find yourself in the valley of loneliness, do not despair. Instead, recognize it as an opportunity to return to God, to rediscover the fullness of life that only He can offer. The temporary loss of others is but a reminder that God's presence is permanent and all-satisfying. Allow Him to fill the void, and you will find not just healing, but a peace that transcends all understanding. In a world filled with distractions, It's easy to overlook the quiet moments when our hearts feel heavy, burdened with loneliness or a deep sense of insignificance. Yet, it is in these very moments that we are invited to turn to gratitude. Jesus calls us to lift our gaze from the shadows of despair and focus on the countless blessings surrounding us. Even in the darkest times, when we feel like the world is closing in, we can find solace in giving thanks, not because everything is perfect, but because God is with us in our imperfection. Gratitude shifts our perspective and opens our hearts to the presence of Christ, who never leaves us, especially in our moments of need. When we feel empty, that emptiness is not a punishment or a sign of failure. Rather, it is a divine opportunity. God uses these feelings of void and loneliness as spaces to fill with His love and presence. As C.S. Lewis insightfully remarked, "We are far too easily pleased. We seek out fleeting pleasures, momentary distractions, and temporary solutions to fill the deep void in our souls. Yet none of these things can satisfy." This emptiness is not a gap to be feared, but an invitation for God to step in and fill it with His unending love and grace. When we invite God into these spaces, we begin to experience the fullness of His transformative love, a love that heals and restores. C.S. Lewis's words carry immense weight when he says, "God does not love us because we are good. His love makes us good." This statement is profound in its simplicity and truth. Too often we approach God feeling inadequate, believing that we must earn His love by being good enough. Yet the beauty of divine love is that it does not depend on our goodness, but on God's unchanging nature. His love is the catalyst that transforms our hearts. It is God's love that makes us worthy, not our actions. Just as a sculptor sees the masterpiece hidden within the stone, God sees the beauty within us, even when we are marred by sin and brokenness. His love chips away at our flaws, refining us into the people we were created to be. Nothing else in this world can satisfy the deep longing within us, because this longing was placed in our hearts by God, and only He can fulfill it. We live in a culture that tells us fulfillment comes from wealth, success, or relationships. However, if we've lived long enough, we know that these things, while valuable, are not enough. As C.S. Lewis pointed out, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. This points to the spiritual truth that only God can meet the deepest needs of our souls. Material possessions, human relationships, or worldly achievements are temporary. They can never truly fill the void that only God is meant to occupy. God promises to provide for us in all ways, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Philippians 4 verse 19 reminds us, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus." This verse is a cornerstone of faith, especially in times of uncertainty and doubt. It is a reassurance that God is fully aware of every need we have, and He is faithful to provide. However, this provision is not limited to our physical needs. The promise of provision goes deeper. It is a promise to meet the needs of our hearts and spirits. When we are lost, God finds us. When we are broken, He heals us. When we are empty, He fills us. He is the ultimate provider, and His provision is abundant, far beyond anything this world can offer. At the core of this message is the call to surrender. Surrendering to God's love and grace is not a one-time event, but a daily practice. It is waking up each morning and acknowledging that we cannot do this life on our own, that we need God's presence and power to guide us. It is recognizing that in our weakness, His strength is made perfect. It is humbling ourselves before God, admitting that nothing else can satisfy, and allowing His love to fill the voids in our hearts. As we surrender, we find a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that the world cannot give. This peace is not the absence of trouble, but the presence of God. It is knowing that, despite our circumstances, we are held in the arms of a loving Father who knows our every need and is faithful to provide. This peace comes when we let go of trying to control everything and trust that God is working all things for our good, even when we cannot see it. Gratitude, trust, and surrender are the keys to unlocking a life of fulfillment and peace in God. When we embrace these truths, we begin to live in the freedom that comes from knowing that we are deeply loved, fully known, and completely cared for by the Creator of the universe. As C.S. Lewis once said, "There are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. This is the hope we cling to, the hope of a future filled with God's goodness and grace." The call to gratitude is not just about saying thank you for the good things in our lives. It is about acknowledging that every moment, whether joyful or challenging, is an opportunity to experience God's love in deeper ways. It is about trusting that, even in the silence, even in the emptiness, God is there, ready to fill us with His love and grace. And it is about surrendering to His will, knowing that His plans for us are good, and His provision is perfect. So we give thanks not just for what we have, but for who God is. We surrender not out of fear, but out of trust. And we rest not in our own strength, but in the unwavering love of God who fills every empty space in our hearts. In the stillness of solitude, there is a divine purpose. It is not a place where God abandons us, but where He draws us closer, enveloping us in His presence. As promised in Hebrews 13, verse 5, "I will never leave you or forsake you." Often we think of loneliness as a sign of being left behind, but solitude is where God whispers truths that we may miss in the noise of our daily lives. In moments when the world feels empty and our hearts ache with isolation, it is a sacred opportunity for transformation. C.S. Lewis once remarked, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God." The world is crowded with Him. He walks everywhere incognito. These words remind us that no matter how isolated we feel, God is always present, often unseen, but deeply woven into the fabric of our lives. Loneliness, far from being an abandonment, becomes a call to deeper communion. Just as Jesus withdrew from the crowds to pray in quiet places, we too are invited into moments where we can hear God more clearly. These moments, when we remove ourselves from the distractions of the world, are not just times of isolation but sanctified spaces where we can sit with God, unburden our hearts, and find clarity and peace. Through self-reflection, we begin to understand how much of our lives are filled with noise, the clamor of ambitions, the demands of relationships, and the endless chatter of our thoughts. In the silence of solitude, we come to realize that these distractions often drown out the voice of God, who has been patiently waiting for us to turn to Him. This solitude is not just about being physically alone, but learning to quiet the soul enough to hear God's voice, which is always calling us into deeper fellowship. Have you ever found yourself feeling lonely even in a crowded room? That sense of disconnection could be a divine invitation to step back and reconnect with the one who knows you best. It is often in these moments of spiritual solitude that we see ourselves more clearly, not as the world sees us, but as God does, beloved, precious, and in need of His grace. C.S. Lewis profoundly taught that God often uses pain as a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. In the same way, He uses loneliness to awaken our hearts to His eternal presence. Lewis writes, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." Loneliness is not something we should fear. It is a gift, an invitation to trust in God's unfailing love, even when we can't feel it immediately. It is a divine message, a call to lean into His promises rather than our fleeting emotions. In loneliness, we are invited to go beyond superficial connections and seek a relationship with God that is deep and sustaining. Pain and loneliness, as hard as they are, can become conduits for transformation. When we find ourselves alone, we often feel the sting of abandonment or the fear of irrelevance. But through these feelings, God is often preparing us for something greater. He is refining our hearts, aligning us more closely with His will. Look at the life of Jesus. In his moments of greatest trial, he sought the Father in solitude. In Gethsemane, Jesus was alone, wrestling with his mission, yet fully trusting in God's plan. In our own Gethsemane moments, we too are called to surrender our fear and trust in God's unwavering presence. These times are not about being abandoned by God, but about stepping into a deeper relationship with Him. Loneliness can be God's invitation to see His plans more clearly, to realign our hearts with His purpose. Often in our pain, we are blinded by what we are losing rather than focusing on what we might gain intimacy with God, trust in His plan, and the realization that His ways are higher than ours. As Isaiah 55:9 reminds us, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts." In these moments of solitude, we begin to see our lives not as isolated incidents of pain or joy, but as threads in the greater tapestry of God's eternal plan. Self-reflection is crucial during these moments of loneliness. We need to ask ourselves, are we allowing the world's noise to overshadow God's voice? Are we filling our lives with distractions to avoid the discomfort of being alone with God? C.S. Lewis reminds us the real problem is not why some pious, humble, believing people suffer, but why some do not. Could it be that through the gift of solitude, God is drawing us into a closer relationship with Him? When we step away from the noise, we make space for God's voice, which has been waiting patiently to guide us. Solitude and loneliness are not punishments, but sacred spaces designed by God for our spiritual growth. They are moments where we are stripped of worldly distractions and forced to confront our need for Him. God uses these moments to refine us, to strengthen our faith, and to remind us that His love is constant, even when we cannot see it. As Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. May we see our times of loneliness not as abandonment, but as opportunities for deep transformation. Let us trust that God is with us, guiding us, and working in ways we may not yet understand. We can take comfort in His promise that He will never leave nor forsake us, and in our quiet moments, we may find that He has been there all along, waiting for us to draw nearer to Him. In a world that often overwhelms us with noise and distraction, the practice of introspection and prayer becomes a sacred retreat. Solitude offers an opportunity to silence the external world and draw closer to the One who never leaves us, opening a space where we can deeply reflect on our faith. The Psalms speak of this quiet communion with God, where we are reminded that His presence is not fleeting but constant. It is in these moments of stillness that we begin to realize that God has always been there. Not just in the dramatic moments of life, but in the simple, ordinary rhythms of our day. As C.S. Lewis so beautifully said, "We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God." The world is crowded with Him. Even knowing this, there are times when we feel abandoned, when the trials of life make us question if God is still with us. It is in these times of loneliness and doubt that we are encouraged to lean deeper into our relationship with God. Like a friend who never tires of listening, He waits for us to speak, to pour out our fears, our anxieties, and our hopes. The beauty of God's guidance is that it does not require us to have everything figured out before we come to Him. We can come as we are broken, confused, or lost and find that He is ready to guide us gently back to peace. As we open our hearts in prayer, we find comfort in His Word and His promises. In John 16 verse 33, Jesus assures us, "In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world." One of the most profound acts of trust we can make is to cast our anxieties upon Him. 1 Peter 5 verse 7 reminds us that we should cast all our cares on God because He cares for us. This is not a passive relinquishment, but an active choice to hand over what burdens us. When we do so, we experience a release from the weight of worry, for we are entrusting our deepest fears to the one who holds all things in his hands. As C.S. Lewis wisely observed, relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done. It is a daily surrender, a practice of trust that grows with time and faith. When we focus on God rather than on our circumstances, we begin to experience an inexplicable peace. Philippians 4 verse 7 speaks of this peace as one that surpasses all understanding and guards our hearts and minds. This is a peace that defies logic, one that persists even when the storms of life rage around us. It is a peace that reminds us we are not alone in our struggles, that God is with us in every trial, offering strength and comfort beyond what we can imagine. To experience this peace is to realize that while we may not be able to control our circumstances, we can always trust in God's presence and His plan for us. Indeed, we are never truly alone. C.S. Lewis's reflection on the presence of God underscores this truth. He walks everywhere incognito, whether we recognize it or not. God is with us in every moment, working quietly and profoundly in the background of our lives. In Matthew 28 verse 20, Jesus reassures us with His promise, "And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." This divine companionship is not conditional or temporary, it is an eternal promise. A relationship that can sustain us through every season of life. Knowing this can transform our perspective, helping us to see that loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection to the one who knows us best. This unwavering presence of God in our lives brings hope, even in the darkest times. Romans 8 verse 28 tells us that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy or that we will be spared from suffering. But it does mean that God is at work, weaving even the most painful circumstances into a tapestry of redemption. He is shaping us, teaching us, and drawing us closer to Himself, even when we cannot see it. As we reflect on these truths, we are filled with gratitude for God's faithful guidance. He does not abandon those who seek Him, but offers Himself as a constant refuge and source of strength. In moments of doubt, we can look back on the times when He has carried us through and trust that He will do so again. This gratitude compels us to not only trust Him more, but to encourage others to do the same. When we share our stories of God's faithfulness, we remind others that they, too, are seen and loved by the Creator of the universe. Our journey of faith is not one we walk alone. It is a shared experience with the body of Christ, where we learn from one another, support one another, and grow together in our understanding of God's love. By casting our anxieties on Him, seeking His guidance in prayer, and resting in the peace He provides, we cultivate a deeper relationship with God that sustains us through all of life's challenges. And in doing so, we become living testimonies of His grace, pointing others to the one who has never failed to guide those in need. Let us be ever mindful of God's presence, His guidance, and His love. In times of solitude and times of community, let us open our hearts to the one who calls us His own. For in Him we find not only peace, but the purpose and strength to face each day with hope and confidence. As we walk with God, may we never forget that He walks with us, guiding, comforting, and calling us ever closer to His heart. God's presence is a constant, weaving through the moments of joy and sorrow in our lives, even when we may not recognize it. As C.S. Lewis aptly reminds us, what we see as interruptions or missteps in our life are often a part of God's greater plan for us. These perceived setbacks are not arbitrary, but purposefully designed to mold us, allowing us to grow in trust and faith. When life doesn't make sense, when the path forward seems unclear, it's easy to feel lost. But Lewis teaches us that trusting God's unseen work can help us embrace His purpose, even in the darkest of times. Loneliness is one of the most profound emotions that humans can experience. In these moments when we feel abandoned or forgotten, it is often hardest to believe in God's presence. Yet, it is precisely during these times that God draws closest. The Bible is filled with reminders of His companionship. Psalm 34 verse 18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Far from being abandoned, we are wrapped in God's comforting presence, invited to lean into His love when the world around us feels empty. Solitude is not loneliness, though the two can feel closely linked. Solitude, when practiced intentionally, is a powerful tool for deepening one's spiritual connection. Just as time alone can strengthen the bond between partners in a marriage, moments of silence with God are vital for nurturing a relationship with Him. Jesus Himself demonstrated this when He retreated to the mountains to pray in Matthew 14 verse 23. This deliberate withdrawal from the noise and busyness of life offers us a chance to hear God's voice more clearly and to align ourselves with His will. C.S. Lewis speaks of the world's desperate need for silence and solitude, not only for personal meditation but for the nurturing of spiritual friendships and growth. The power of stillness is profound, offering clarity and insight that are often missed in the hustle of daily life. Isaiah 50 verse 4 tells us that the sovereign Lord has given me a well-instructed tongue, to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed. Solitude opens the door to this kind of awakening, where we begin to listen deeply for God's guidance, understanding our divine purpose. Sometimes God intentionally leads us into solitude to separate us from distractions, so we can attune to His voice. Jeremiah 17 verse 5 warns against putting our trust in man or earthly things, teaching us that true reliance must be on God. These moments of solitude are not designed to encourage independence from God, but to foster dependence on Him. By stepping away from the noise of life, we can hear His guidance more clearly and recognize the greater purpose He has for us. Trusting God's plan requires surrender. As Proverbs 3 verse 5 reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. When our own plans fall apart, when jobs fail, relationships break, or paths close, it is not a sign of abandonment, but of redirection. God is always leading us toward His purpose, even when the way seems fraught with loss. Through solitude, we find the strength to trust, knowing that God's hand is guiding us toward a greater joy, far beyond our understanding. In moments of difficulty, it's easy to feel alone. Yet the Bible reminds us that God is always there, ready to comfort and lift us. Psalm 145 verse 14 emphasizes this truth: the Lord upholds all who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. No matter how far we fall, God is by our side, offering a hand of support in our times of weakness. C.S. Lewis, in his reflections on faith, often spoke about the quiet strength that God provides, particularly when we feel abandoned or isolated. He once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world, even when it feels like the world is closing in. Those pains are an opportunity to turn to God and hear His voice more clearly." Loneliness, often seen as a burden, can also be an essential part of spiritual growth. As Luke 5 verse 16 tells us, even Jesus sought solitude to deepen His relationship with the Father, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Through solitude, we can create space to hear God more clearly and allow His presence to shape us. When we find ourselves pulled away from relationships or community, it may be God's way of drawing us into a season of spiritual transformation. C.S. Lewis beautifully reflects on this journey, acknowledging that solitude can be a teacher if we allow it to deepen our connection with God. Just as Jesus used His moments of solitude for prayer, we too can use this time to listen more closely to God's guidance. Often, God prepares us for greater things through seasons of loneliness and separation. In 2 Corinthians 6 verse 17, Paul reminds us that God calls us to come out from the world, to be separate, not as a form of punishment, but as preparation. This time of isolation is not a punishment, rather, it is an opportunity to be molded and prepared for a mission that we may not yet fully understand. It is in these quiet, unseen moments that God does His most profound work within us, shaping our hearts and minds for what lies ahead. C.S. Lewis, reflecting on his own life, often spoke of how God's plan for us is far greater than we can imagine, even if we don't always understand His methods in the moment. Humility is a cornerstone of this process. As James 4 verse 10 reminds us, humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. Recognizing that God's plans are higher than ours is an act of surrender, allowing Him to guide us even when the path seems uncertain. In this humility, we open ourselves to God's purpose, trusting that He will raise us up in due time. It's a surrender that feels counterintuitive in a world that prizes independence, yet it is through this submission that we find true freedom and growth. Prayer becomes our lifeline in these seasons of solitude. When relationships feel inadequate to fill the emptiness, we realize that only God can satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts. Through prayer, we connect with Him in a way that no earthly relationship can provide. The power of prayer in these moments is transformative. It allows us to shift our focus from the isolation we feel to the closeness we can experience with God. It is in these moments that we learn to trust Him more deeply, recognizing that He alone can fill the void that loneliness often leaves. C.S. Lewis, in his profound understanding of faith, often highlighted how loneliness could be a tool that brings us closer to God. In his own words, he said, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." This insight reminds us that the pain of loneliness can lead to the most beautiful outcomes in our spiritual journey. When we are stripped of distractions, we can find peace in God's presence, knowing that He is enough. The message is one of encouragement. In times of loneliness, God is not absent. He is preparing us for something greater. These moments of solitude are opportunities to grow in faith, deepen our connection with Him, and discover the peace that only His love can bring. We may not understand the full purpose of our isolation, but we can trust that God is guiding us, lifting us up when we fall, and preparing our hearts for the work He has in store. Through it all, we give thanks, for in every season, whether in joy or in loneliness, God is faithfully present, guiding those who seek Him.